Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Samurai Shodown Sen, also known as Samurai Shodown Edge of Destiny, originally for arcades but later released on Xbox 360, which is of course the version you're seeing here. This is a 3D fighting game developed by SNK Playmore and self-published in Japan, but in North America it was published by Xseed Games, and in the EU it was published by Rising Star Games. And it was first released in 2008 for arcades in Japan, and it later saw Xbox 360 release in 2009 in Japan, and finally 2010 in the West. And it was met with a generally pretty negative reception. Most people seemed to not like it very much, and they tended to say it was very middle of the road at best. And it was generally seen to be something of a cash grab, but a relatively competent one at that. Now you may be expecting well, that raises the question of whether or not they're right about this bit here, but that's not what I'm going to say. In fact, what I'm going to say is, did we play the same game? Because the Samurai Shodown Sen I played wasn't anything remotely resembling middle of the road. Let's go ahead and tear into this thing and find out why. Well, the first thing you notice about the game is that it is ugly as sin. The game was released in 2008 in arcades, but it looks like it came straight out of the PS2 era. Actually, that's being generous. Tekken 4 looks better than this, and Tekken 4 came out in 2001 in arcades. The modeling is weak, the texture quality is downright horrible. There's a ton of jagged edges all over the place, and really the only thing that looks even halfway decent in this game are the environments, and even those don't look very good. At least that's as far as the actual game visuals go. If you go with the actual artwork that accompany the game, the concept art, the artwork on the character select screen and everything, sure, it is somewhat enlarged on the actual game, but it's very well done artwork. It's just a shame that they enlarged it for the actual game, so it ends up looking pixelated. But hey, at least they managed to make the character animations competent. It's not amazing, but they work and they flow together fairly well. You do get a few jagged animations here and there, but most of the time it works. But those jagged bits do really emphasize one really nasty problem that this game has that I'll explain more when I get to the gameplay, and that is just the idea of stiffness. Now, again, I'll explain that more later, but just understand that that oddly stiff combat that you're seeing isn't just the visuals. And of course, once you get past the visuals, you end up in the sound design, where things are kind of all over the place. The music is mostly fairly solid. It's not amazing, but it's definitely very Japanese-inspired stuff that sounds mostly at home in a Samurai Shodown game, but none of them are very memorable, and unfortunately, they really just aren't up to par with the classic Samurai Shodown soundtracks. Voice acting's mostly competent, but that's partly because the vast majority of it is Japanese, so most of the time you don't even really notice it apart from, oh hey, they're saying something in Japanese that I'm not understanding. Although it does raise the point that the translation in this game is actually pretty awful in a lot of spots. It's really janky and there's a lot of very direct translations that just don't work. Or if they don't do a direct translation, they'll try something creative with it only to have it really not convey the meaning of the actual Japanese phrase. But when you look at the English voice acting, it is only for the announcer and they barely say anything and it's really corny. Honestly, the only reason I didn't switch this over to Japanese is because if you do that, it doesn't just change the announcer voice, it changes all of the text to Japanese as well. And while I can read a fair bit of Japanese, having all of the menus in Japanese when I didn't know exactly what they were to begin with becomes kind of a problem. And then of course there's the sound effects, which are trying to convey a sort of anime style, but at the same time they just aren't really quite as hard-hitting as we'd really hope for. So what you end up with is sound design that is overall fairly weak and visuals that are downright awful. But of course, as messy as the presentation is, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, except that this game doesn't really have that much of a story. Sure, each character has their own motivations for doing what they're doing, and there is a sort of overarching story involving the final boss of the game, Golba, who's basically trying to build up an army so he can conquer the entirety of Europe, and everyone else is given fairly shaky motivations for actually going after him. But if you're expecting much in the way of story here, you're really not going to find it. Every single character does have an opening sequence where it gives you a bunch of text giving you their motivation for going on their adventure. And of course you'll get an end crawl when you beat Golba, but beyond that, you're really not getting much story. There's only maybe 1 or 2 cutscenes in the entire game, and they really don't do anything to flesh out the story and the characters. So what you're ultimately left with is the gameplay itself, which is a pretty standard 3D fighting game with 24 characters to choose from, 13 of which are from previous Samurai Shodown games like, say, Haomaru, Rimuru, Nakoruru, Jubei, Hanzo, those sorts of characters. But unfortunately, most of them have been changed for the worse, and part of that is because of the actual controls of the game, but I'll get to that in a moment. What's immediately noticeable is that there are no projectiles in this game anymore unless you're playing as Draco, who is the most ridiculously overpowered character in the entire game. He's a Western gunfighter whose primary weapon is a shotgun, and he can just kind of spam it constantly. I mean, seriously, look at this. It's ridiculous. This is weird in that it means that Golba, the final boss, is actually a bit easier to fight than Draco is. It's just that the AI is capable of blocking or dodging every single thing you do and hitting you with combos that do a massive amount of damage. Draco has that, and he has a shotgun, so it's just blatantly broken at that point. Oh yeah, and the even more fun part, you can actually unlock both Golba and Draco. But the way you do that is by clearing arcade mode with 12 different characters to unlock Draco and clearing it with all of the characters in order to unlock Golba. And chances are, if you for some baffling reason decided to play this game, you're not going to get past maybe 2 or 3 characters through the arcade mode at best. This is because of a couple of reasons. First off, if you're a returning series fan, you're going to find that your favorite characters don't really play like they're supposed to anymore. Haomaru, for example, no longer has the whirlwind attack that he had in previous Samurai Shodown games where he could send a whirlwind forward. To do Ukyo's move where he just does a very rapid series of slashes, you actually have to hammer the attack button to be able to do that. Any attack that was a projectile before is no longer a projectile. It's a very short range attack, and the characters who fought with animals, for example Nakoruru or Galford, don't fight with animals anymore. I mean, they have them to some degree, but they're not alongside them the entire time. They only pop in for a single attack and then they disappear right off the bat, which means that while they do still have that functionality to some degree, it's pretty lamely implemented. And while a lot of the maneuvers from previous Samurai Shodown games are still there, they're rather crudely implemented or have some odd control schemes. Like, for example, a couple of characters having moves that would have just been a one-off maneuver in the earlier games, but now you have to hammer the attack button to get them to actually continue working properly. So the old characters are changed up enough that it's actually rather difficult to adjust to playing them in this, and the new characters don't really pick up the slack, partly because they're all extremely bland and boring designs. It's like SNK just went to the bin of extremely generic character designs and said, let's just throw a bunch of these into our game that has a lot of really iconic characters in it. That'll totally work really well, right? I mean, they'll totally remember this guy who just has a sword and, oh, but he has an afro, that must make him particularly compelling. Or this other guy who also has a sword, but he's kinda angry, so that's what makes him cool, right? No. The new characters just do not hold a candle to the old ones, and what you end up with is a roster that, while certainly well-sized, is ultimately rather baffling. I mean, the Samurai Shodown series has had some really great character designs in it that were pretty unique, and they just said, you know what, we're not gonna do that this time around. And that really does hurt this game in the long run, because if you didn't have those established series characters to draw on, then the roster would be downright pathetic. But frankly, the rather generic character designs they threw in there to fill out the roster are the least of this game's problems. Before I explain to you what ultimately destroys this game, I want to mention that this thing doesn't really have that much content. While there are 24 fighters to choose from, you only get your arcade mode, which is called story mode in this. your basic offline and online versus, and a survival mode, which is basically just you with a limited health bar going up against enemy after enemy in quick succession. And then of course there's the one mode where you don't really play it so much as you just mess around with it, and that's the practice mode. It's just a basic practice mode like in any other fighting game these days. And what that ultimately means is that this thing relies very, very heavily on its core mechanics. And its core mechanics are complete and utter garbage. It's trying to be a 3D fighting game in the style of Soul Calibur. You have your horizontal and vertical slashes, you have a kick button, and you have a special action button, which is basically just a throw. And through a combination of these various attacks, you will be able to chain together combos as well as engage in special moves. There is also a heavy slash that you can do, whether it's horizontal or vertical, and it does a very large degree of damage and sends the enemy reeling for a while. There is a Pow Meter that builds up as you take damage and eventually allows you to engage in a rage explosion like in other Samurai Shodown games before it, and then of course you can do some special rage explosion moves, as well as what's known as the Desperation Slash, which is basically just the Fatal Flash from the previous Samurai Shodown games, but with a different name and some slightly different parameters. Now the thing is, you're never going to actually see one of those in this video because of the one really nasty problem that plagues this game no matter what maneuver you're trying to do. The controls are terrible. Whether you're using the D-pad or the analog stick, and I'm assuming if you were using an arcade stick it would be the same way, the controls are just plain non-responsive. You'll enter the exact commands you need to engage a special move, for example, and it just won't do anything. If you're lucky, you'll just do a normal attack instead, but most of the time you just end up kind of flailing around like an idiot. And anything that requires precise timing, yeah, forget about it. I mean, there is a sort of deflecting maneuver you can do where you can deflect an attack, sort of like a guard break in Soul Calibur, but I've never managed to consciously get one to work. It's always been when I've been pressing other things, trying to do other maneuvers, and all of a sudden it will actually trigger. This is why throughout all of the clips you've seen me using mostly some very simple maneuvers. It's because if I try to do more advanced maneuvers, they just do not work. There's only one other game I've run into that has that problem, and that's King of Fighters 13, although I managed to get the special moves working when I use the analog stick in that rather than the D-pad. In Samurai Shodown Sen, no matter what I use, it just doesn't work. And it's worth keeping in mind that the movement is also extremely slow in this game, so if you're trying to actually sidestep an attack, for example, good luck with it because it may or may not work. Either you will jump or you will sidestep, and it's pretty much a crapshoot as to which one you're actually going to do. This is why all of this footage looks like someone who has absolutely no idea what they're doing is playing the game. The thing is, I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm a veteran of fighting games. I mean, I'm not exactly a great player or anything. In fact, I'd argue I'm a fairly crappy fighting game player, but I at least know how to play them, as you can easily confirm by watching any of my reviews of other fighting games. But this one is just complete crap. And it's not like the multiplayer can even save this because nobody is still playing this online, and for very good reason. About the only things it does that would actually bring people in are A, it's a Samurai Shodown game, so it's got series fans interested in it at least from that standpoint, even though they abandoned it very quickly. It's got rather bloody and somewhat gruesome fatality moves where you can behead your enemies or chop their arms or hands off or chop them in half and things like that. Which you could of course do in previous Samurai Shodown games, and in fact in 5 Special, some of those maneuvers were fairly gruesome, but the thing is that they were rather cartoony in those, and in this you really get more of that Ermagerd so edgy style where when, for example, you chop an enemy's hand off, they start writhing on the ground in pain as their severed limb spews blood all over the place, which I guess is more in keeping with, say, 5 Special because of the fatality moves you had in that being fairly gruesome in some spots, but when you compare it to the previous Samurai Shodown games, when you just chop them in half or chop their bodies apart or things like that, they just slid apart and there wasn't really much in the way of blood and gore, and it wasn't really gruesome. It was kind of classy, and this one is just really kind of tasteless. And really that just sums the game up as a whole. It's a tasteless cash grab that was thrown together to really just make some money off the Samurai Shodown license. Instead of trying to bring the Samurai Shodown gameplay style into the third dimension, sort of like what 64 and Warrior's Rage tried to do but didn't really do it very well, you end up with a game that's trying and failing miserably to copy Soul Calibur's gameplay style, but throw in a bit of edginess and hey, it's the Samurai Shodown license, so we've got that going for us, right? Well, I hate to break it to you, but no, you don't. Because of how incredibly terrible the controls are and how awkward and clunky the combat itself is, you end up having arguably the worst fighting game of the 7th generation of consoles. It's the kind of bad you would compare to the likes of, say, Star Wars Masters of Teräs Käsi. But here's the thing about that. At least Masters of Teräs Käsi is so bad it's funny. This is just terrible, in all respects. Avoid it like the plague. I give it a 0.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.